This is the New Nationalist Perspective with Dr. Tom Sunic, brought to you by the Voice of Reason Broadcast Network. Dr. Tomislav Sunic is a former professor, author, translator, and diplomat. Visit his website for interviews, essays, books, and more at tomsunic.info. And now here's your host, Tom Sunic.
Good evening, everybody. This is Tom Sunic, or Dr. Tom Sunic, or you can call me Tom. And I'm very pleased to be on the air. And let me send my best greetings to everybody, to all patriots and our Europeans all around the world, and especially to our folks in California. Listen, folks, this is going to be a very easygoing show, and from now on I will be hosting some friends of mine and also some prominent personalities, and I very much hope that you will enjoy it. I've been thinking about this show for quite some time. I've been talking to some of my friends, including Steve and Peter and Mishka, and I couldn't make, indeed, the executive decision what I should start with. But it seems to me, folks, that we got to approach the crucial problem in our daily existence, regardless whether we are manual workers, blue-collar workers, intellectuals, or academics, peasants, you name it. We need to know exactly what does cultural hegemony mean? In plain English. We're not going to use some tricky words, some too academic words. And in fact, the purpose of this show is to speak in plain English and to explain to our audience some major problems that we're all facing. So in fact, I intend to talk a little bit about masters of discourse and who actually frames our discourse. Not just the discourse that we see on CNN and New York Times and other journals, but also daily discourse in shops and anywhere else. Hence the reason that I thought that we might start with this meaning of cultural hegemony and discuss a little bit what that means for the average American, or for that matter for any white person who lives in Europe. What does cultural hegemony mean? I'm quite certain that many of you have no idea what I'm talking about. Many of you have never heard that expression. But believe it or not, folks, those who run the show in terms of opinion making know very, very well, they know deadly well what cultural hegemony means. Well, I'll just give you a brief definition. Cultural hegemony means, according to the Marxist vocabulary, because this was the word that was used by a Marxist scholar, prisoner of consciousness back in the Mussolini government, Antonio Gramsci, you may have heard of him. He actually, unlike Marx, thought that in order to gain political power, you first and foremost have to walk through institutions. You have to gain intellectual power. So, to put it simply, by cultural hegemony, what we mean is opinion-making industry and those who are behind it. So I would like to know, how does the average American, or for that matter, or an average white man who lives in Argentina or South Africa, or for that matter, even Taiwan or anywhere else, how does he relate to that? What does he think about himself? Is he a victim of someone else's cultural hegemony? How does he define it? And what needs to be done in order to retrieve our own European cultural hegemony? And please do accept my apologies if I'm using this word cultural hegemony. I'm using that word specifically because it has been spread out, and Marxists, in fact, liberal intellectuals, they use it quite often in the media and in mainstream press. But if you wish, folks, and later on we'll be taking some calls in my next shows, and I certainly don't mind using the synonym, if you wish, like opinion-making industry. We live in a world which is entirely how can I put it? Intertwined with different groups and different networks, and again, to put it bluntly, I'm using the word cultural hegemony. If you wish, we can stick with the word, with the expression opinion-making industry. Let me, folks, also introduce you to a friend of mine. I'm sitting next to him, and he's just, well, I don't want to flatter him too much. He's a very intelligent guy. He has certainly all qualities because, after all, he's a friend of mine. But I would just like to know myself, how do you, with, let's say, you can call the guy Joe Sixpacks. How does a Joe Sixpack in California define opinion-making industry? And what does he think about himself? And I would like to ask Gregor, what do you think about, let's just start with the basics. What do you think about cultural hegemony? How do you relate to this opinion-making industry? What do you think about yourself? Are you a victim of it? Do you think you can affect it? Or is there some threat? Is there some conspiracy theory? Or is there something bad behind? And I certainly am very much interested in sounding out folks, folks that I meet at the pharmacy, at the drugstore, and elsewhere. Go ahead.
Yeah, Tom, thanks for inviting me. And this term, cultural hegemony, I ran across it about 25 years ago when I was studying the Marxists up on a local university campus. And as you say, that came from Antonio Gramsci, whose idea was that if a group wants to take control of power in society, they don't go directly for the political levers directly. What they do is they endeavor to gain huge influence over the cultural level. And I'm almost 60 years old, so
well, we're more or less on the same page. I'm not that far either.
Yeah, and actually, I'm not Joe Sixpack. I'm Joe Case of Wine sometimes.
Excellent. Yes.
But anyway, so I first heard that term, although the term really came into my life after I'd experienced it. I'd experienced that there seems to be a source of power on the cultural level, which to me is kind of uncomfortable. Somebody else is defining what my culture is. And I don't know exactly who's doing this, but I feel a little bit like, who are they to do that? And it concerned me because...
By all means. In fact, if you don't mind, Gregor, I was just wondering, I myself, I'll tell you quite frankly, despite my titles and my degrees, I'm still a little bit puzzled, and I'm trying to find out what does the average American, either in South Carolina, or for that matter, an average white man who lives in Argentina or Croatia, or for that matter, any place in Europe, how does he define culture? Because it seems to me, and I'm not trying to be provocative, that this word, culture, has been debased. It has been maltreated, if I can put it that way, and I'm extremely suspicious when somebody starts talking about culture. How do you define yourself? How do you use this word in your daily lingo, culture?
Well, it's kind of a split personality because I'm part Southern. My father's from East Texas. That's kind of the western edge of the South. And my mother's family is an old California family, but all parts of my family are European-derived peoples. So the culture that I grew up in, I grew up in it as an American, but as I look closer, I realized this all came from Europe. But I didn't really think of it as explicitly European. I just thought this is how it is everywhere. This is when I was a kid. Most people when they're in their teens, they don't really think of, well, what's my culture versus what's somebody else's culture. At least wasn't my experience. I lived in a small town, and everybody grew up kind of under the same culture, and it was it was a white European American culture. Okay.
The reason I'm asking it, you remember we took a walk a little bit, and I'm sure our listeners would like to know that themselves, like. We saw the sign someplace, the gay culture, the lesbian culture. Santa Cruz is very much a very, very bizarre town. And I myself am very upset with this fluid notion of culture. There's such elasticity of the word, and I'm sure you will agree with me, the culture etymologically, when we look at the culture. My dad, for instance, and your dad, I'm quite certain, 60 or 70 years ago, when they used this word culture, it had a specific meaning. And nowadays, it has no meaning whatsoever.
Well,
like we talk about drug culture, we talk about lesbian culture, we talk about homosexual culture. It seems to me that this word has become so debased that we either have to replace embrace it, we have to reject it, or we have to stop the show then.
Well, speaking of my father, I don't think they use the term culture explicitly. I think they grew up in an area where it didn't change very fast. The people that were outside of their little area, maybe a 100-mile radius or something, everybody in that area was somewhat similar. Okay?
Exactly.
And although in East Texas there was the black groups and there was the white groups, and they didn't mix very much. There was rules. There was two different cultures in that area. But as far as me growing up, I never thought about the word culture much because it was all, it was just what we were.
It was just taken for granted, right?
Taken for granted. But now it's like we are confronted with a lot of culture that's been synthetically created by the mainstream media, by Hollywood, and it's certainly not my culture, and I don't know who the heck's culture it is. So we're in this new zeitgeist or something where there's all these synthetic cultures coming in, and the traditional cultures are getting edged out and pushed away by these other things, I feel. So, okay, I live in the town that you mentioned, but I don't think there, is such a thing as Santa Cruz culture. There's feminist culture. There's lesbian, gay, bisexual, whatever culture. There's a lot of Hispanic culture here. It seems like the white European culture doesn't actually have an explicit place. At least we're not allowed to say that without people calling us names.
I'm very glad that you made this point. Again, as I said earlier, dear listeners, dear friends, and dear colleagues, we need first and foremost clarify this word, because I don't want to sound too academic, but we need to specify nonetheless that this word culture has been subjected to semantic distortions, as linguists say. After all, I must admit I'm also a linguist myself. And I'm quite proud and glad of it. And I'm very, very much upset when, for instance, different lifestyles, I'm talking about lifestyles, I'm not talking about ethnicities, when they use this word culture. By the way, it just occurred to me the other day, I was going through the book. You may be familiar, and I would certainly suggest you to read the book by Ezra Pound. It's called The Guide to Culture. It's spelled Kultcher. It's a very interesting manual indeed, just to give you an idea of what culture has been going through over the last 60, 70 years, not just in the States, but in Europe. And again, we got to be extremely careful with this word, because as I understand it, as my friend Gregory understands this word culture, it means something old, rooted, and of course it cannot be learned overnight. It takes years of reading and studying, and like his dad, like my dad, the word culture at that time, let's say 50 or 60 years ago, had a specific meaning. And nowadays what we are basically witnessing, and I presume that my guest Gregor will agree with that, this word has been, this concept, and not just the word, has been kidnapped from ourselves, from our vocabulary. It's being used now for purposes which are completely trivial and which are absolutely hostile to what I call the European culture. When I say, for instance, European culture, which I'm proud of, I'll give you just three little points. It's Roman, Greek culture, it's medieval culture, it's all the European tradition. Okay, just to sum it up, all what Europe, all what America was founded upon, this is what our culture is all about. But over the last 20 years, unfortunately, you will agree with me, we've been witnessing this distortion of this concept, and hence this misunderstanding, and I'm probably harping too much on it. Well, folks, I guess we should probably take a little bit break and just gather take some breath as well, and continue with our cultural show. Let me just specify one thing. Our culture is Mozart, our culture is Bach. Well, why not? We can just as well listen a little bit to Lynyrd Skynyrd, for that matter, or Grateful Dead we grew up with. So this is also part of our white European and American
bluegrass,
culture.
little Cajun music.
Fine. Cajun music is fine. And thank you very much, folks. We'll be back with you. Don't go away. And thanks much. And see you soon.
We'll be right back with the New Nationalist Perspective. You're listening to the Voice of Reason Broadcast Network, ReasonRadioNetwork.com.
never in my wildest childhood imaginings.
Supreme Court nominee Sonia Sotomayor is set to visit Capitol Hill today. She's making a traditional round of courtesy calls, meeting with some of the senators who could make her the country's first Hispanic Supreme Court justice. She'll sit down with Senate Democratic leader Harry Reid as well as Republican leader Mitch McConnell. In total, Sotomayor meets with 10 senators during her first day on the Hill. She'll be taking breaks in between to huddle with the White House team, guiding her confirmation. It's an important part of the senatorial get-togethers that will set the tone for her confirmation hearings. The White House wants Sotomayor to be confirmed before the Senate's August break, but Republican Senator McConnell has said he's in no hurry to start the hearings. As the confirmation process presses on, the White House is presenting Sotomayor as an experienced federal judge. It argues she'll administer justice with respect for the law and an understanding of life's hardships. Republicans say they're going to challenge her to make sure Sotomayor won't be an activist judge. Barring any surprises, she is expected to be confirmed in time for the court's new term in October. John Belmont, The Associated Press.
And now let's return to the New Nationalist Perspective with Tom Sunic. Brought to you by the Voice of Reason Broadcast Network, ReasonRadioNetwork.com.
The pleasure is to blame. Ain't no difference what you say. I don't shade green. The only gun I need is the ace of spades. The ace of spades.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our show. This is Dr. Tom Sunic, or Tom, or Dr. Tom, or you can all call me Tom. Well, listen, folks, I hope I'm not bothering you too much, but the reason I'm so tough about the clarification of some concepts is very simple, because being born in ex-communist Yugoslavia, I learned very early the importance of language and how, in fact, the political class and political elites can use the language in order to foster, in order to promote their goals. And I had some very bad experience about that, and I'm quite certain we shall have a chance to talk about this in our next shows. And I certainly would like to always start with a clarification of concepts and terms and words, and naturally when we talk about culture we need to bring up the issue of identity. We need to bring up the word multicultural. Who exactly defines? Did it ever cross your mind when that word multiculturalism appeared in the English vocabulary? For that matter, ladies and gentlemen and dear colleagues and friends, I guess with all due modesty I need to say a few words about myself so that you know who you're talking about and who you're actually talking to. This is a Voice of Reason, the show, and thanks to my colleagues we've been able to put it up, and thanks to some of my friends we've been able to set it up also technically and logistically, and I hope it will last for quite some time. And for some reasons, we want to call this show the Nationalist Perspective, although, again, I always have problems with this word nationalism because the word nationalism has a different connotation nowadays in the United States from what it has in Europe. So, again, there are quite a few thorny paths that we need to go through in order to find some common language, if I can put it that way. But one thing I can tell you for sure is that be it me or for that matter Gregor, who is sitting next to me, my guest today, we do have a common culture, despite the fact that I was born in Europe and in, communist Yugoslavia, and he was born here in California. Our parents, our grandparents had lots of common. They shared the same culture. And this is the most important thing. So we got to bring back, or we have to retrieve some of the definitions at least of what culture is all about. And once again, I urge you to be skeptical. I urge you also to think twice when you encounter somebody, be it on campus nowadays in California, or be it in your office, or for that matter at your working place. When a person starts talking about culture, the first thing that crosses my mind, who defines culture? And cui bono, who actually benefits from this? And I'm sure we shall have, in due time, we shall have a chance to discuss more explicitly about, not just about the role of culture, but also what the Germans call Kulturträger, those who bear culture, those who carry culture. It's a beautiful German word, and I'm proud that I speak German quite well, and I'm quite happy, and in fact I would be more than pleased one of these days, ladies and gentlemen, to take some calls from our French-speaking and German-speaking folks, because this is all our European culture and that we have to be proud of. And we don't want to make this show a blasphemy show. We don't want to call names here. We don't want to reject other cultures. All what we want to do is retrieve our culture, define our culture, promote our culture. Well, so as I said, ladies and gentlemen and dear listeners, I do not consider this show of mine as a one-way show, or rather as a multilateral, as a monologue, if you want to put it that way. I'd like to interact. I would like to share with you some of my views, and in fact, some of my experience that I've had all around the world. As I said, I was a graduate student here at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I was a professor for quite some time, but I'm very proud that I've published quite a bit of scholarly pieces on dealing with different issues, mainly theoretical, political, philosophical issues. And I'd be very pleased if you could, if we could also get some listeners who are more interested, who are interested in this topic, and why not? As far as I'm concerned, I wouldn't mind getting some calls also in French or in German, and have them make some comments. I have a guest of mine here, Gregor, who is a great guy. In fact, he's helping me a little bit with those technical issues, and I certainly don't want to get too personal with. I'm not so much versed in mathematics, but I'm a man of the metaphor, if I can put it that way. And I certainly like metaphor in the European culture. We were talking about culture, and naturally this whole issue of culture brings up different issues. Identity. How do we define our identity? What does identity mean in postmodernity? Our show is called Nationalist Perspective, but for a variety of reasons I've been a little bit, and I'm still a little bit wary and suspicious of this word nationalism, because in different areas of the world, especially in Europe, in Eastern Europe, which I know rather well, the word nationalism has a rather bad and almost politically incorrect connotation. In America, especially among many quote-unquote right-wingers and conservatives, nationalism is used as a standard denomination, and it doesn't have necessarily a bad connotation. And but for that matter, we are all to some extent victims of this new lingo that has overwhelmed us. And look at, for instance, the word political correctness. Look at the word political rectitude. I hate using those words because I know better words, I know better expressions. But short of anything, something better, we just have to stick with what we have. And I certainly would like to, given the fact that I'm with a good friend Gregor, who is helping me out a little bit with his machinery. We are here in his bureau and his office full of those technical gadgets, and I certainly would like to sound him out a little bit about culture and identity, and I certainly would like to hear him. Gregor, what do you think about our future shows and about my shows? And like, having the fact is that you have lived in this country far longer, much longer than I have, and I'm quite certain that many Americans, just average Americans, down-to-earth Americans, would like to focus on some topics. But again, from European perspective, be it the French perspective, Croatian perspective, or American perspective, and there might probably be some topics that may be more interesting, more likable to them than something else. First and foremost, we need to clarify one thing, and I said it at the beginning. We don't want to bother folks. We don't want to put them to sleep. We want to talk about real issues with lots of examples.
Well, Tom, once again, I think identity is one of the key things. I think that Americans who are of European ancestry, white European Americans, have got an identity problem. I think that our identity has been substituted. Our original or our true identity has actually sort of been filled in with a mass media generated, dare I say, Mammonite, money-oriented identity where we think that the purpose in life is making money and having stuff.
Money talks, right?
Yeah, well, money does talk, but sometimes it yells too loud and covers up things that are more important. Mm-hmm. So I hope that your shows from here on out actually talk to the average people and ask questions that make them think about their identity, because I know that most Americans really don't spend a lot of time talking about Gramsci and Long March Through the Institutions or Marxist theory. And a lot of the ones that do talk about that don't know what they're talking about. The ones in the university, young skulls filled with mush that have been marched out of Marxist education systems, and they go out in the world and they find out they have to work. Well, I think the average working American looks back 2 generations and sees their parents and what they did. They're going to get a better education on their identity by looking at that. Mm-hmm. And hopefully, if they had a good, upbringing. But I hope that, this show can, and Tom's guests can basically address the idea of what it means to be a European American mm-hmm. for mm-hmm. those of us that are Americans, and can help us to learn a way of talking about ourselves that helps us reconnect with our deeper identity.
Absolutely. Gregor, I'm sure you will agree with me, and I assume most of my listeners will agree with me, that this first show of mine, first show of ours, if I can put it that way, is more or less general. We're just throwing in at the audience now some major issues. But I certainly want to promise to all of you, to our dear friends, our comrades, our patriots, that from now on, or rather in my forthcoming shows, I'll try to narrow down topics as much as possible. Of course, we need our audience. We need to tell them exactly what culture is all about, because despite the fact that I know the etymology of the word, I know where the word comes from. It's a Latin word cultus, which had a different somewhat meaning from today's meaning. Of course it had. But we need to sort of set the framework for our discussions, but at the same time, we need to make our discussions palatable to our audience, and not just to academics, not just to American academics who share in advance our views, but also who might be interested in learning something. And of course, which brings us then back to this concept of identity. So I guess today this is just a general type of a framework for our future shows, and today we'll end up with this rhetorical question: what is identity? What is culture? And I'm sure, ladies and gentlemen, very, very soon, very shortly, we'll talk about the multicultural identity, what exactly that means. And I can tell you...
Is there such a thing, Tom?
There's no such thing. This is a lexical fraud, I can tell you that, because that word popped up about 20 years ago. Actually, it's a word for multiracialism, but our leftist and liberal colleagues are not very fond of it. They prefer the word multiculturalism, which is another Mickey Mouse, word.
Well, why would they be afraid of saying what they want?
And precisely because they don't recognize, they don't acknowledge our culture, our traditional culture.
How rude of them.
How rude of them. In fact, I must quote, we don't want to name drop too much, but the fact of the matter is, if you remember Nietzsche 100 years ago, he said there was a transvaluation, in fact, a transformation of all values. So including, unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, our language. So much for today, ladies and gentlemen. I'm certain that we shall have a chance to talk a little bit more. And as I said a while ago, we are not some paleo-conservative or traditional conservative. We don't want to put any names or any labels on our show. Folks often ask me if I'm a left-winger or right-winger. Those words are meaningless nowadays. We are fighting basically for one thing, or the two things. First, to retrieve our culture. Second, to retrieve our identity. Well, I hope we'll hear some good music, probably something rockish or something classical. And thanks again for bearing and being with me, folks. And I'm sure you'll be on the air. And don't go away. Stay with us. And I'll talk to you later, and again, we have to clarify those issues that we're dealing with.
We'll be back with more from Tom Sunic after this break at ReasonRadioNetwork.com.
AP News Minute. Supreme Court Justice nominee Sonia Sotomayor has been taking questions from those who will decide whether she'll sit on the bench. She was on Capitol Hill today, meeting with leaders from both parties. Democrats want a quick confirmation process, but Republicans say there's no need to rush. GM is said to be in agreement to sell Hummer to a Chinese company. GM is working to sell off brands after wrapping itself in bankruptcy protection. A source says Hummer would fall to an industrial company. Brazilian military jets have located 2 areas of floating debris that could be from the Air France flight that went missing Sunday. The debris is close to the path the plane would have been traveling. Officials say there are no signs of life. It's not what you'd expect to see, and residents in one Wisconsin town stayed away as this bear enjoyed the view from a neighborhood tree. Officials decided not to shoot it down, but capture it once it came down on its own. Ed Donahue, The Associated Press, with AP News Minute.
You're listening to the Voice of Reason Broadcast Network, ReasonRadioNetwork.com. And now let's return to the New Nationalist Perspective with Tom Sunic.
Good afternoon, good morning again. Welcome back to VOR. Welcome back to Dr. Tom Sunic's show. Welcome back to a Nationalist Perspective. I'm pleased to have you here, folks, and I hope we have lots of work to do here. You may have probably realized right at the beginning of my first segment that we are dealing here with some linguistic and lexical issues. Probably I am a little bit too obsessed with those things, but you got to understand me. I myself, being a linguist and also political scientist, I need to know exactly what words mean and what actually political concepts mean. And let me tell you an example. When I, for instance, read a piece, let's say in the New York Times or in the Washington Post, I want to know exactly who is the author of that piece and what type of a lingo, what type of a language that gentleman and that journalist uses. This may sound a little bit off the wall what I'm talking about. I'll tell you one little example just to clarify it. When I was a kid, my dad, who was a lawyer in ex-communist Yugoslavia, he went to prison for his anti-communist and Catholic beliefs. He was eventually adopted by Amnesty International and also by 15 congressmen here in the States, but let's leave that aside. The fact is, one important thing I learned from my dad. He told me, look, son, when you travel countries, when you go different places, when you study different identities of different peoples and different citizens, the first thing you want to know is not what the Constitution is all about and how this country, or a given country, brags about human rights and tolerance and what have you. The first thing you got to look at is what? Take a wild guess. Well, first thing you got to look at is the criminal code. I'm sure, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, dear comrades, will have a chance to survey and to explain a little bit what's going on in Europe and what's going on in the United States with those linguistical, I can call it, aberrations and oxymorons such as hate speech and what have you. You may ask, what the heck is this guy talking about? What does this have to do with identity? Well, of course, dear friends, it has to do with our identity very, very much. Because in the final analysis, I guess I don't want to pontificate here, but you will agree with me, what I'm interested in is not just my identity, but who defines my identity. I don't want to have somebody else define my identity. I don't want to have Hollywood, for that matter, define my identity, despite the fact that I'm a great fan of Schwarzenegger. Actually, he's my next-door neighbor from Zagreb, where I was born, to Graz is about 60 miles, so I guess I know very much where he's coming from. So yes, dear folks, dear ladies and gentlemen, we need to clarify the identification of in fact, the meaning of identity. We have to know exactly who is using that word, because it's such a widespread word. And I also, given the fact that this is our first show, I will be doing subsequent shows with the clarification of some terms. Before we get down to, let's say, hate laws, before we get down with issues such as multiculturalism and demographics and geopolitics, or for that matter literature, or for that matter Southern Comfort, if you wish, we need to know exactly who defines the language, who defines the meta-language of our modern, postmodern society, including the United States of America. In my first segment, I started a little bit with culture, and we still haven't come up with a good and clear-cut definition of culture. The reason being, as I said, you remember, folks, the reason being is that culture and the meaning of culture has been kidnapped from us. It is no longer us who define the culture. The same thing could be said about identity. And I certainly want to make sure that we scoop, under quotation marks, under this concept of identity, different branches of our white European activity or American European activities, not just philosophy or literature or art, which certainly we shall be talking about. And I'm very proud to tell you that I've spent my whole life reading, and I'll be very pleased also to talk about modern art and figurative art. And I wrote a piece a long time ago on the art in the Third Reich, and to what extent that art was a replica of the neoclassical art, and what extent it was a quote-unquote degenerate art. So there are many millions of issues we've got to talk about, but what I need to clarify is that identity is not just art or literature, it is also our cuisine. It may sound a little bit bizarre to some of you, but that's the fact of the matter. How people cook in France, I'm sure most of you are victims of those cliches that French only have cheese. Well, of course, they have 300 cheeses. I'm pretty much familiar with those cheeses, and Camembert or Roquefort and what have you. But our European identity certainly has a certain nuanced attitude towards cuisines. Like most of you may not be familiar with the Croatian cuisine, and most of you may not be familiar with the German cuisine. And these are very generic expressions, because those of you who traveled across Germany will know that in Flensburg, which is down south, and the Freiburg, which is up north, there's a huge difference in cooking. And why cooking? Of course, we don't just eat to fill our bellies or so stomachs and to get stuffed, so to say. We very often through cuisine you can sort of decipher the philosophy of a given nation, of a given people, of a given race, and the French have, of course, a very sophisticated cuisine, but this tells you also how sophisticated they were in the first place, particularly with their dramas and with their theaters. And I certainly wouldn't mind one of these days having a guest or somebody, some of you who may probably be a little bit more familiar than me with different culinary practices in different parts of Europe and the United States of America. Unfortunately, we all happen to be nowadays victims of this concept of fast food, fast sex, and fast death, unfortunately. And in the process, we have lost much of those tiny, nuanced fingerprints, if I can put it that way, that require lots of time, lots of energy, but first and foremost, a great deal of spirit. And I'm glad I'm staying here with Greg, and he's a good guy, because the way I look at him, I don't want to flatter him, I keep telling that, but he's a great cook, and he's also a man who knows very much. He also wrote a book about some other issues, but I certainly would be pleased to sound him out, how actually he can transcribe, if you allow me this expression, cooking into high culture. Because, again, most of you, or most of us, get scared when we talk about high culture. We think only about Armani suits, about ballet shoes, and some Mickey Mouse folks who are just fooling us. But it's more than that. It's culture, it's peasant culture, European culture. We all, after all, if you wish, if I trace my genealogy, I go back to my grandparents who were peasants, who were people from the land, from the soil, and who, of course, cooked in their way, and who actually share their meals. I'm sure most of you will know that back in, 30, 40 years ago in France or in Spain and in Croatia, people would gather for lunch. The lunch would last for 4 or 5 hours sometimes. So this was not just a place to regurgitate and to, how can I say, to eat and to munch things. But this was the place where there was a sort of a spiritual communion. So I just said it in passing, and I certainly would like to give a word for a second to Gregor, so he can tell us a little bit about the spiritual and cultural transcription and the quotation marks of cuisine, and particularly how do you basically, Gregor, view this cuisine in America as opposed to, let's say, the French cuisine?
Well, I'm not sure if that's the exact way I would start to open the topic up. I would say that since we're talking about identity here, that the people who are concerned about their identity need to look at where it comes from, where they gain their self-perception of what they are. For the last 40, 50 years, because of television and the movies, we've actually had our identity colonized by forces that, are trying to tell us who we are. For instance, up until very recently, almost everything I knew about sort of the Second World War in terms of the pictures that were in my mind, these came from movies that somebody else created. So, it's only recently that I've realized that maybe those pictures weren't accurate. Well, the same thing takes place in other areas of identity. So in terms of where food fits into that is, before there was the technology for telling people what they are through commercial mass media, people came to know what they are deep inside through their family connections, through their family practices, the habits, the customs, the traditions.
Good point.
And these things were all transmitted through families or extended families or village groups of families, and, lots of cousins, and Grandma Mabel or whoever she is would cook certain things. Well, I think most of the people listening to this will probably recognize if they have a flavor or something that they've eaten or some food cooking that smells like home, smells like something they've had when they were a little kid. There's something that you can't really put words on that. It's like this is like something. It makes you feel warm inside. It makes you feel like your mother and father are at the table and they're caring for you, and your brothers and sisters are throwing mashed potatoes at you, but you love them too.
It's a very good point, because as a matter of fact, I remember when I was a kid, I have those memories. I can think about odors in the kitchen where my mom was cooking.
Oh, yeah.
So I know for some folks this may sound a little bit bizarre that we are talking about the identity in cooking, but
Well,
basically
we're not just
you can tell very much someone's identity. I'm pretty much sure when you look at the person, what he eats and how he makes his pick, you can tell probably about his character.
Well, you can tell a lot, and this whole thing of identity is so important to what's happening in the world today, because it's not enough for us to identify the quote unquote bad guys that are doing something against us. We have to know who we are. In other words, if we feel like we've lost our identity, pointing out the people that may be, it's like if you're taking flak, you're probably flying over enemy territory. Well, pointing out the enemy isn't going to do it. You've got to realize, well, what are we? So more than half of the battle, I think, with what I would say the problem that's happening with our people, the Europeans, wherever they are in the world, is that they've lost their identity. And I think that the intellectual, political, cultural, talking about Gramsci, talking about the long march to the institutions, this is important for the movers and shakers and for the people who may be the leaders of the left side of the bell curve, as some people call it. But most people aren't going to be interested in this yet. if we approach, them at a level which is, okay, this is who you are. This is who your mother and father were. This is who your grandparents were. This is who your great-grandparents were, as far back as you can go. Okay? And you are carrying on a tradition, you basically are bearing the burden of all of your ancestors. But this isn't a horrible burden. This is a wonderful burden that basically that is the culture. Now, most of my ancestors were farmers. And they didn't spend a lot of time reading about Gramsci and Marxism, but they were, by and large, very intelligent people. And they had common sense.
They had common sense.
So I'm hoping that, if Tom will allow it, at some point, in the future shows, I can go a little bit deeper into this. But I think people don't limit this to the political. Think about the stuff that tells you, this is who I am at a gut level. Maybe there's no words for those smells of your mother's cookies or stew or pot roasts, And one more thing, Tom, is the whole idea of American identity. So many people say, well, what's American food? And somebody else says hamburgers. Well, that's baloney. One of my great-great-grandfathers was from Strasbourg, which is, I believe, in the southern part of Germany, very near France.
Yes, it's right on the border.
And, I hear stories told by my father of him, growing his own tobacco down south and making wine from all these berries, everything. He made his own bullets that he went hunting with. And, this is all stuff that's in the family. We go back and we look at these people. But he came to America. He became an American, but he brought European culture, European country folk culture. So essentially, what I'm trying to say here is that Americans are actually an extension of their European past. So we're not something different. We're not a propositional nation. We are a people that has a tradition, and there's many different parts of that tradition. We have to go into it and rediscover that, and not to go back to the past, but to carry it forward.
I'm so glad that you brought this up, and in particular this cliche that we are all victims of a propositional nation, and this is something that our listeners would be happy to hear. So basically, folks, I'm sure that you're beginning to realize this is not going to be a one single issue show. I take certain pride in it. Pardon me, I don't want to sound too abrasive, but I don't want to be a false. I don't want to posture here with false modesty either. I spent my whole life reading and studying and living in different parts of the world, particularly in Europe. So I'm very pleased if I can share my experience with you. So basically, yes, we are looking today at one aspect of this identity, but certainly we shall not just talk about nurture. We shall talk about nature, and we shall also talk about the IQs, and we shall see actually who defines. We shall come to those topics, folks, so please don't go away. We shall be covering. We shall also have some very prominent speakers and prominent guests at my show, and I would be more than delighted to also take some of your calls eventually at some point. And don't go away, and we shall be talking about meta-language in our next issue and in our next segment, and hopefully next time we shall try to focus a little bit more on culture and multiculture and what exactly those concepts mean in our postmodernity.
We'll be right back with the New Nationalist Perspective. You're listening to the Voice of Reason Broadcast Network, ReasonRadioNetwork.com.
AP Money Minute. The next turn for General Motors' Hummer brand could be a sale. A day after filing for bankruptcy protection, GM announced it has reached a tentative agreement to sell the brand. The buyer is said to be a Chinese manufacturer. If completed as hoped, the sale would save more than 3,000 U.S. jobs, and Hummer would live another day. There's a fresh sign of life for the housing market. Pending home sales in April posted the largest monthly rise in nearly 8 years. The index from the National Association of Realtors rose 6.7%, well above expectations. It is a gauge of the number of homebuyers who've agreed to purchase a previously occupied home. And this view could be in your future for a real bargain. The National Park Service will waive entrance fees at nearly 150 national parks and monuments for 3 weekends this summer. The remaining national parks are already free. Entry fees being waived range from $3 to $25. I'm Mark Hamrick with AP Money Minute.
Now for the final segment of Tom Sunic's New Nationalist Perspective. Brought to you by the Voice of Reason Broadcast Network, reasonradionetwork.com.
We're back again, folks. This is Tom Sunic speaking again, and I'm pleased to have you on board with me. You notice that I'm sort of tossing in quite a few of issues, and I'm sort of preparing the terrain, so to speak, for our next cultural warfare, if I can put it that way. And to be perfectly honest with you, I had some second thoughts about even this nationalist perspective. Have you ever thought about the word nationalism and nationalist and culture? Those words have a different resonance, but they also have a different meaning in some different European countries. Like, for instance, the German word Kultur is not exactly the same thing. It's not the replica of the English word culture, which we already covered, and which we realized how much that word became decayed and dissolved by different pressure groups. And we'll certainly, as we proceed with our shows, we'll try to narrow down, and we shall try to focus on one single issue. In passing, let me mention the word nationalism, nationalist perspective. I did have some doubts about that. We might probably even change the title of it, because I don't know how many of you realized the fact that the word nationalism has also been subject to semantic distortions in the mainstream media in Europe. So many white Euro-Americans, they use the word nationalism, the word which is not quite common among white Europeans overseas. So at some point, I'm not ruling out, we might even come up with a better description of our show. Today, as we are wrapping up our last segment of our first show, I just want to clarify that we are going to be dealing for some time with this meaning of culture, culture as the French call it, or cultura as the Russians call it, and we shall see different aberrations of and how that word has been stolen, so to speak, and defined by somebody else. I also as I mentioned, I will be having some very good, very prominent guests on my show, and I'm very happy that they will bring their perspective as well. And I got a whole load of topics that I can think of, but eventually we'll be taking your calls, and we'll be also discussing face-to-face, so to speak, about some burning issues. I myself, I'm always a little bit worried about this word culture, because it has been so much abused. Once again, let me remind you, there's about this good book by Ezra Pound, Guide to Culture. So, Guide to Culture, it's spelled Kulchur. You may want to have a look at it. It's, Ezra Pound was a great guy of a tremendous erudition. It's really something stunning erudition, and it makes me think, how some fine authors, American, European authors, have disappeared from library shelves. And once again, I just want to make sure, I don't want to sound too apologetic. We don't want to get too academic. We don't want to call names in the show. What we are interested in is retrieving our European American culture. In other words, we want to be proud of what we are, and we should not allow other folks, our races, if you wish, other cultures to define my culture. And we also have to realize one other important thing, that there is not a single European culture. There are different cultures in Europe, but they have a common denominator, namely the European roots, the Indo-European roots, and certainly this is something worth talking about. So, ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends, we shall talk about issues like race, we shall talk about poetry, we shall talk about cuisine. I certainly plan to devote my next show to the meaning of multiculturalism, to this strange aberration, because that word doesn't even exist. It didn't exist 20 years ago. It's basically euphemism, and you will agree with me, for multiracialism. But as you know, many of our opponents, or detractors, let's call them like that, or foes, if you wish, are not too happy using the word multiracialism, so instead they had to come up with this, Mickey Mouse word, multiculturalism. I myself, my grandparents were born in a multicultural country, namely Austro-Hungarian Empire, and I'm quite proud of it, and I'm also proud of the fact that I'm fluent in several languages, so I'm proud of being a multicultural person, but not the way somebody else defined it for me. And this is something, ladies and gentlemen, we have to be quite clear about. Who is the master of the discourse? Who defines our lingo? Who defines our grammar, our syntax, our sentence structure? And this is something which I presume will also be quite appealing to a younger audience, because we're not going to just talk about Mozart, or for that matter some classical painters, or Michelangelo, or what have you. We shall be talking also about modern culture, with European culture, European-based culture. Why not? We can talk, as I mentioned last time, Lynyrd Skynyrd. We may just as well spend some time talking about Blood and Honor and some great German bands like Böse Onkels or Lanzer. When we want to listen to what those folks talk about in their lyrics, in the German lyrics, and when they talk about identity, or Identität as the Germans call it. So I certainly would encourage you to listen also. Why not? After all, this is part of me, and I grew up with Lynyrd Skynyrd, but I also grew up with Böse Onkels and the German bands. So I certainly would appreciate having your opinion on that particular issue. So as you can see, we get lots of things to talk about. One thing I'll promise you for sure, as we move on gradually, we shall narrow down, we shall try to examine things, and we certainly want to make sure, and once we get feedback from our listeners, we want to make sure that we, and I myself, do not sound too academic. We just want to use plain English, nice English. We don't want to call names. We want to avoid vulgar words or gross words. And in fact, what Ezra Pound wrote about, we just want to resuscitate our linguistic, our lexical culture. Most of you realize that even this neighbor, or what you call it, boys in the hood culture, even the language, the English language that we are using nowadays, has lost much of its verve, much of its nicety and beauty. And this is something also worth thinking about. And I would be pleased to have your feedback, and I certainly, at the time being, don't hesitate to log in and drop a line and probably suggest some points that we can discuss about. I can discuss about what drug culture. Can you look at this oxymoron, drug culture? I mean, I never thought, 50 years ago that this word would even occur, drug culture. Unfortunately, we live in this sort of a society, the German call it Spaßgesellschaft, or let's call it the dictatorship of well-being, where the role model is how you got to be rich and how you got to look good and how you have to make lots of money. On the other hand, I don't want to sound too pessimistic. The basic thing of this whole show is to retrieve, regroup, and recoup our European identity. And thank you very much for your attention, folks. And don't go away. Log in. Step in, send some feedbacks, and I would be very, very happy to have you on my show, and I would be more than happy to have you call me and chat about different topics and different problems we're all facing, folks. Thank you very much, and this was Tom Sunic, VOR, Nationalist Perspective Show.
Thanks for listening. The New Nationalist Perspective with Tom Sunic will return next Tuesday from 9 to 10 p.m. Eastern U.S. Time. Join us at ReasonRadioNetwork.com.